Very happy to be here. Thanks for welcoming me. I'm a bit impressed, and I hope, and first, I apologize for my English, because I hope it will be okay. And don't hesitate to tell me if I speak too, maybe not too loud enough, you will tell me. And I hesitated about what I would say tonight. Maybe I can just give a little bit more examples about what I've been studying for the past decade in different countries with a team, an interdisciplinary team of researchers and people interested in trying to transform capitalism, we could say this, and people who are either academics but also practitioners, people working in big companies, people working in NGOs and local communities members. And I felt it was a great opportunity for me to meet with all kinds of people and trying to reflect together about the possible change. So to give you an idea of the people and the places where we have been leading some surveys and trying to reflect on these issues, Nigeria is one of the countries where we have led research from 2004 to 2013, so almost 10 years, and with a team with academics from Nigeria or from African countries, and with also academics from France. We tried to lead some qualitative and quantitative surveys in order to reflect on issues related to oil and oil and gas production, but also to try to assess the impact of this economic activity on the lifestyle and the issues for local people and local communities, and try to assess whether this kind of activity can really favor the empowerment of the people and real development. And I mentioned this research because I have worked also with a Jesuit who is currently the chief economist of the French Development Agency, and his name is Gaël Giraud. And together we tried to build an index, because the engineers from Total, the French oil company, told me that they are engineers, so they believe in figures. So I was mostly focused on qualitative surveys, and they said, well, if you had some figures to give us, it would support your perspective. So I discussed with Gaël, and we decided to create what we called a relational capability index, which tries to assess the quality of social bonds in a community between people, and also in a political society, try to assess the quality of relations between and among people. For those who are used to the social capital theory, it's like bonding, bridging, and linking social capital, so different kinds of creating relationships, close relationships between people and then between groups, and try to see how economic activity of multinational corporations contributes to the quality of social bonds or deteriorates these bonds. And what was obvious when we had interviews with people in the communities neighboring the oil facilities, that the people get frustrated. There are in Africa, people are supposed to, well, we always speak of the quality of bonds within the extended families, and the survey that we led showed that the quality of trust within the families deteriorated. So, which is just to highlight the fact that when we speak about development, when we speak about economic activity, maybe we could put at the first place this question of how to promote the quality of social and ecological bonds. And I start with this example because the research that we have carried out for 10 years, because in a way it may be the most important part of the research I try to promote, how to see if business and big businesses and also maybe also public policies led by different kinds of governments, do they favor the quality of social and ecological bonds? And not only social bonds on a short-term basis, but also how do we care for nature, for the environment, and today and for the future generations. So that's in a way that's the core aspect of my research. And I mention this because right now, and Jessica was mentioning the Paris Agreement, the COP21 agreement. We know that we have to change, and that the changes that are necessary are radical. But in fact, if we could, after my talk, share maybe our experiences about the ways forward, at least in France, what I see and when I discuss with people, it's quite frustrating. And I think for many people, and for different kinds of reasons, we don't know exactly what we should do, or sometimes people have ideas, but they don't succeed in translating these ideas in their day-to-day life. And I would like to give 3 examples and then try to look at different kinds of principles that could maybe help us try to implement ecological transition and try to reflect on the kind of collective discernment we could try to carry out together in order to make a real change in our societies. So the examples are diverse, but they are related to conversations I had with some people or experiences I made. The first one has to see with the fact that some people are, from professional perspective, they are practitioners, and they can be involved in, for example, sustainable development or this kind of activity. And recently I discussed with one friend of mine who is in charge of programming in his big company to foster development in sub-Saharan Africa. And he was telling me that he had very interesting discussions with some young executives in his big company who are in favor of sustainable development, who try to promote programs, but then whenever they have a vacation period, they go to different countries and they with a plane. And he gave an example. He said, well, you went to Vietnam last month for your vacation, and if your carbon footprint is like 6 tons to go to Vietnam and go back to Paris. He said, well, do you realize that it's completely inconsistent with what you claim in your job? And maybe for other people is the contrary. The situation they try to we have different scenarios, but it's very complicated to be consistent at a personal level, at a professional level. And I imagine that each one of you had these kind of examples. And myself, for example, I've been invited to join a conference in Mexico next summer. I really hesitate to go there because I don't know whether it's a good choice to make. So we really have to think about these day-to-day choices. And also another example that we could give is as consumers. In my former community in Lübeck in Paris, we had discussions because every year we try to make choices and we try to reduce our expenses. But it means that, for example, when we buy clothes, we are not, sometimes we just think that maybe it's 10 euros, great. And we say, well, I will buy this clothes and that's it. And we don't look at the consequences for people who are in Bangladesh or in other countries and who work in very difficult situations. So the second example is related to these global value chains. And a third example, and maybe for me it's one of my major concerns right now, has to see with education. And I teach at ESSEC, the business school, which is a quite famous business school in France. I also teach at the École des Mines de Paris, which is an engineering school, also quite well known. And I also give a course at Centre Sèvres It's a joint course for Centre Sept, so the Jesuits and religious and Sisters of the Assumption and lay people, and it's combined with the course is also given to political Sciences Po students, so young people. So all these young people, they are intelligent. And the courses I give are about social justice and ecological justice, or about ecological transition, or capitalism and ethics, this kind of of topics. And when I discuss with these young people, more and more, my impression is that they are very frustrated because they realize that they will face major challenges. And most of the time, at least for some of these young people, they are really aware that the curricula are completely also inconsistent with these major ethical issues related to climate change and environment and ecology. And if we speak Pope Francis, integral ecology means holistic perspective on all this. And I give you an example. 2 years ago, just before the COP21, I discussed with Jean-Michel Blanquer, who was the managing director of ESSEC and now is the Minister of Education. Wow. And he was congratulating us about what we were doing in my research program and other professors at ESSEC. So I asked him, well, how do you see the impact of climate change on the curricula at ESSEC Business School? And he ended my sentence saying, we are in a dead end. So I think, well, great. He's really convinced that there is an issue there. And he added, but we have to be the best in the international rankings, and our students have to be have to get the highest salaries when they leave ESSEC. So it was for me, and that's it. He was not even discussing that it was complicated for him because he's the managing director of a good school. Just, well, we are in a dead end, but our students, we are going to train them in order to go there as fast as possible. So for me, it's he's not worse than many other people. I mean, he's a very gentle person, but when you hear this kind of talk, it's in fact very cynical. Mm. So I give just, and you could give plenty of examples about these tensions that all of us experience, and for me and for I think for many. For the majority of us, it's very difficult to know how we can try not only to make personal choices, but to reflect at a collective level, to try to see what are the levers in order to change not only, of course, maybe the business and the economic models, but also our choices as consumers, as citizens. What do we have room of space to change things or not? Well, it's a question. So I try to reflect on these issues with other people, and we try to promote not only an interdisciplinary perspective, but also in company they like to speak about multi-stakeholder dialogue and this kind of thing. Try to see things from the perspective of different kinds of actors, and try to open the floor to discussions, to deep discussions, to help people, for example, from these big companies or top executives, but also parliament members or people, and for these people to meet with people with a different vision, and maybe to help them reflect in a different way. So that's what we try to do. And if I summarize the different aspects of our research and the kind of dialogue we try to promote, I would say that there are 3 dimensions that are interconnected, and I would like to make links with Laudato Si. And one dimension is more related to economic aspects, the second one to cultural issues, and the third one to political issues. And that's what I call the conditions for an eco-justice. I'm playing with eco and ecological, but maybe also ecological and economic justice, to combine them. And so the first dimension is related to the sustainable creation and management and the fair share of resources. I think it's very important. Most of the time, when we discuss about economic issues, we think that we have to make sure that the cake will grow in order to share in a fair way. And it's and economists have these kind of arguments, and also political philosophers, because most of the time when philosophers were speaking about social justice, it was about distributive justice. Meant, well, how do we share? And is it according to the social criteria? It depends. If you are a Marxian, you will say, well, it's according to maybe to your needs. If you are living maybe 2 centuries ago, they would say that it's according to your position in society. So, and most of the time, people were not looking at the conditions for a fair share. Maybe we have to create in a fairer way. And now with all these ecological issues, we realize that we don't have plenty of resources, and we have limited resources, so we have to think about the way we create wealth before sharing this wealth. And I think that most of the time when people speak of sustainable development, at least in big companies, they still think that growth is a prerequisite in order then to share. And I think that the Pope, in the number 194 of the encyclical, he puts this perspective in a very clear way, and maybe very tough. He says, it is not enough to balance in the medium term the protection of nature with financial gain, or the preservation of the environment with progress. Halfway measures simply delay the inevitable disaster. Put simply, it is a matter of redefining our notion of progress. A technological and economic development which does not leave in its wake a better world and an integrally higher quality of life cannot be considered progress. Frequently, in fact, people's quality of life actually diminishes by the deterioration of the environment, the low quality of food, or the depletion of resources in the midst of economic growth. In this context, talk of sustainable growth usually becomes a way of distracting attention and offering excuses. It absorbs the language and values of ecology into the categories of finance and technocracy, and the social and environmental responsibility of businesses often gets reduced to a series of marketing and image-enhancing measures. So I think it's a very interesting quotation, because when the Pope says halfway measures simply delay the inevitable disaster, he doesn't speak of a win-win strategy, but in fact, it's this kind of thinking that most of the time when I discuss with people, top executives and people who have responsibility in big business, they would say, well, first we have to promote economic and financial growth, and then we have to try to be cautious about the environment and try to protect people. But anyway, you can feel that the priority is economic and financial. And here the Pope says, well, be careful, because if you have this kind of reasoning, yeah, sorry, all the time, in fact, you don't really look after the possible disasters. And it means that we really have to think about, to change our priorities and think about economic growth as a means in order to promote a quality of life and a better quality of life. And I think it's also our experience that sometimes we know that there are many issues in our countries related to junk food, for example, obesity, and many kind of illnesses, and because people, and mostly poor people, they don't eat healthy food. And so maybe we should first try to see how we could help people change the food they get, and it would change the way we look at issues related to agriculture, agro-industry, and all this. But most of the time we think that we have to promote big business and then see how they can try to change the way they envision the economic model they run. So in this regard, we really have maybe to change the way we envision the priorities, and maybe also, but I will come back to this perspective, to the political perspective afterward. Try to see how to put pressure on public authorities and or different ways in order to change the rules of the game and make sure that the companies will be obliged in a way to integrate in their economic models issues related to just creation of economic and financial value. So that's the first perspective related to, but I will go back to concrete measures that we can think about in terms of changing the rules of the game. That would be the next part. So first dimension is the economic dimension related to fair creation and fair share of resources. Then the second dimension is related to well, we could use different kinds of words, but maybe the issue of recognition of every person, including the most vulnerable people in society. I think at least in English-speaking countries, many people speak about the quality of care. And so in French, we don't know how to translate it. In fact, we say care. and we speak about recognition, care, trust. It means promoting the quality of social bonds in a community, and not only at a local level, but also paying attention to the quality of social bonds in other communities. And also maybe also with nature and with living beings, and not only human beings. And if we try to look at the situation of the people in this regard, maybe also we are going to change the way we look at business models. So that's a second perspective. And I would like to quote, to give, well, maybe the number 46 of the encyclical letter, Laudato Si. The Pope says, "The growth of the past 2 centuries has not always led to an integral development and an improvement in the quality of life. Some of these signs are also symptomatic of real social decline, the silent rupture of the bonds of integration and social cohesion." So I think a few years ago, Tim Jackson gave a report. He wrote a report with some other people and he gave it to the Prime Minister in UK about, and the title was of the report was "Prosperity Without Growth." The idea was to reflect on economic models which could promote a shared prosperity in a society while reducing, when we was saying without growth or with a very low level of growth, which is what we experience in our countries. And I think we shouldn't try to increase the growth rate, at least the kind of growth that the way we calculate growth in terms of GDP. When we speak of growth and degrowth, we always have to think about what kind of growth are we speaking of and what kind of degrowth are we favoring. So that's the second aspect. And for example, I was speaking of Nigeria and oil companies. We have also for 6 years we have had a research agreement with Danone, the French company, and it was on issues related to recycling of plastic in Indonesia and then in Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. And it was very interesting because Danone wanted to promote the empowerment of waste pickers who were collecting the plastic that comes from the plastic produced by Danone, what they sell in Indonesia. It's aqua bottles, Bonafont bottles in Mexico, Evian bottles in France and all over the planet. All this, so they were thinking of integrating recycled PET into the plastic bottle that they sell in different countries. And so they said they were thinking that they had to take a responsibility towards waste pickers who collect were the first, the first link in the value chain. Yeah, first. And so they asked us to assess some of the programs they were leading in Indonesia and then in Mexico. And then we went to Brazil and Argentina. And it was very interesting because we were discussing with these waste pickers. And in fact, I'd say two things about this issue of recognition. In a way, these people are what the side of the culture of waste that the Pope denounces. And he says, well, in fact, we produce tons of waste, or billions of tons of waste every year, and part of the waste, the waste of bad quality, we export this waste to poor countries. So it creates major issues in terms of health for people. So we have examples in mind in Ivory Coast or in different countries. So, and then also the problem of waste is also that we consider people as waste in our societies. And sometimes on these global value chain issues, some of the waste pickers, not all of them, but some of them, they're really people who are left aside. And we had discussions with Danone because they were thinking of mechanizing part of the work of the waste pickers. And they were wondering whether it was a good idea or not. And I discussed a lot with some NGO people from working in NGOs who tried to analyze the situation of these waste pickers. And also the survey that we led showed that, in fact, it was the situation of the worse off was worse when we mechanize. Because the people, if there is a mechanization of this activity, some people, the people who will be hired in order to carry on the work will be the people who can respect some rules and who are skilled in a way. Well, and the poorest people, the most vulnerable people, they have no more activity. So I don't say that of course we have to try to improve the situation of the waste pickers everywhere, but then how to make sure that the poorest of the poor are not, that the situation of these people is not worsened because we think that mechanization is always a good thing. Yeah.
But did you say waste pickers?
Yes, waste pickers. Yeah. Sorry, because...
Could you describe what that is?
Waste pickers, like people who collect the waste. And in many countries, these people, they live, and sometimes in the dump.
Okay. Yeah.
And they are called pemulung in Indonesia, and 1% of the population in Indonesia collects the waste. And in fact, the situation of these waste pickers is very diverse. In Mexico, where we led some surveys, we went to different landfills and we compared the situation of the waste pickers. Some of them choose to work there, and before they were working in factories. And they say that they preferred to work because they felt that they had a kind of freedom working in these landfills, and that the situation was better, and that they were earning more money than when they were workers in the factories. But we also met many very, very poor people. So, in fact, we really have to see, it's very difficult to generalize the situation. But at least this issue of how do we consider people, how can we try to promote the inclusion of and the recognition of these people in our societies. And it was with Danone and the other companies and NGOs which we worked on this issue. It was interesting because when we were discussing with some waste pickers, they felt that the fact that ecology is now a major issue had a consequence for them, a positive consequence, because they felt that in a way they were like promoting ecology, and that the image they had about their work was much more positive than it was before. So it's interesting because it says something about the way we look at the people and the way we favor the quality of the work, that any kind of work that people do can be recognized as the meaningful job. And when we went to Argentina, it was very inspiring to listen to people who knew Pope Francis, and he was visiting some of the places where we went to, and these people were so enthusiastic about the work they were doing because they had, when Bergoglio was the bishop, he went there regularly, he was meeting them, and so they felt very proud about their job. So I think it's for all of us interesting because sometimes we think that only intellectual work are there is the kind of hierarchy in our societies from many different perspectives, and try to reflect differently on what we do, and maybe these people are the most useful people on earth right now because they fight against pollution and all this. So the second aspect, I think, from a cultural perspective, how can we change our common representations about what is really meaningful in our societies? That's the second perspective. And the third one is the political aspect. Till recently, when I was reflecting on this political perspective, I was mostly focused on how to make sure that people who are marginalized or people who cannot raise a voice can have a voice in the decision-making process. So the issue of participation and representation. And, I think it still is a major issue, but I would say that this political reflection has really two sides, and the two sides have consequences when we reflect on the responsibility of businesses. The second aspect is related to violence. And the fact that I read a lot Gandhi these past months, it was like, in French I would say, an electroshock. The fact that very often when I was reflecting on economic models, I was mostly focused on how can we create wealth in a different way, how can we try to make sure that people will be involved along global value chains. I was not really reflecting on violence and the kind of violence created by our economic models. In a way, because I was reflecting on the poorest people, but trying to reflect from this non-violent perspective on the quality of bonds that we want to promote among people and with the milieu, the natural and cultural milieu where we are living. I think it can really completely change the way we also reflect on our economic models, and that's exactly what Gandhi was doing when he was reflecting, and he had this beautiful notion of Swaraj. He wrote a book in 1909 when he was in South Africa, so it was before all his activity in India, and Swaraj was this idea of self-governing. And it's also interesting because it was from a personal perspective, but also from a collective perspective. And some people say that it's a kind of reflection that we had in the 18th century in England and France when we were promoting the Enlightenment and trying to promote, empowering people and making sure that people will decide for themselves, personally and collectively, what they want to do. But then, with the idea of Swaraj, Gandhi speaks also of Swadeshi. Is it okay? And the idea that we have to be frugal in the way frugality is very important when we reflect on self-governing. And it's this idea of Swadeshi, it's like promoting local food, local production, and promoting the quality of life in a political community. It's also completely interconnected with the idea of non-violence satyagraha, and that's really, and so the idea of Swaraj and all the three aspects are completely, you cannot have one aspect and not the others, at least I think in a Gandhian perspective. And when today we reflect on the necessary changes in our lifestyles, I think most of the time we reflect in a very fragmented perspective. And in big companies, it's also the same when I discuss with some friends who are in charge of human resources, of finance, or accounting standards, or all this. Each one of them are a very specific position, and they are in charge of a specific perspective. And when they try to raise a voice and try to ask questions about maybe the meaning of what the company is doing, or it's very complicated to promote. I would say, I don't have the word in English, but to reflect not from a compartmentalized. Yeah, thanks. and holistic, and how to promote this holistic perspective, and realizing that, in fact, it's also related to this kind of win-win perspective we have in mind most of the time. We think that we can combine economic activities with social well-being and ecology, but most of the time we don't really take into account the consequences for the most vulnerable beings or people, and we don't reflect on the violence created by these economic models. And I think I had also chosen a quote from the encyclical letter on this perspective, but I don't find it. But anyway, I think the Gandhian perspective is very close to what the Pope describes in terms of integral ecology, because he said that when we speak of ecology, it's not about environment only, but he said integral ecology is environmental, social, economic ecology, and then he adds it's a cultural ecology and ecology of daily life. It means that all aspects have to be taken together, and on a personal and maybe more short-term perspective, and also at a larger scale and from a collective perspective. Means maybe I'll just add a few examples of what we could do with if we try to combine the three aspects, these three dimensions, economic, cultural, and political, and try to reflect on the changes in terms. I will give some example concerning the rules of the game of companies, because I've been working on these issues with some friends who either work in big companies or are economists or parliament members, and we try to find ways to put more pressure on the government or on CEOs of the companies in order to change the way we look at the economic models. And I will give some, maybe 5 different perspectives, possible perspectives. The first one is related to global value chain. For the past maybe 10 years, we have been discussing, people have been discussing at the UN level or at the OECD level in terms of what they call due diligence. Mm-hmm. And due diligence, it means trying to make sure that when companies start an activity, they will try to develop business models in order not to be complicit of violations of human rights in their area of influence. So all these words should be discussed, because what does it mean to speak of area of influence, and to what extent do we think that companies are in charge of not only of their employees but also of the subcontractors and all this. And we know about for example, the Rana Plaza disaster in Bangladesh a few years ago, where some women like 1,200 women died because they were sewing the clothes that we buy then in Auchan, Gap, Benetton, all these shops, and I think in France there were huge debates on this, and many NGOs were very active in trying to make consumers more sensitive to these issues. And last February, after 3 years of discussions also at the parliament, we have a law on due diligence, which is, I think, a very good news, because it's a minimal law. It's just that the big companies have to publish every year a plan where they explain what they will do in order to try to make sure that they won't be complicit of violation of human rights. Then there is no penalty, because if they don't do, in fact they don't do what they say, they claim that they will do. But anyway, they have to publish this plan, due diligence. And it's interesting because some other countries are thinking of having the same kind of regulation. And also at the UN level in Geneva for the past 3 years, thanks to the initiative led by South Africa and Ecuador, there is a proposal to have a treaty, a binding treaty for multinational corporations on due diligence. So of course, European Union is against it, which is quite a pity, but at least there are some debates going on. And we'll see what happens. But anyway, in France, we succeeded in having the law. So now we try, and they win because I represent an NGO, and we try to put pressure on Macron and the government to try to convince him and the government that for France now it would be better to have common regulation at a global level, because we have this law, and top executives were saying, well, it's a problem for the in terms of competitiveness of French companies in different countries, which is a quite cynical reflection. But anyway, if now that we have a law in France, we can at least try to promote this kind of law at an international level. So not sure that Macron will favor it, but our Minister of Foreign Affairs is in favor of it. Nicolas Hulot, who is number 3 in the government, is strongly in favor of it. So we'll see. So hopefully, maybe something will happen. So that's the first aspect. I think a second very important aspect is related to changing the accounting standards. And I think in England is related to, maybe Catherine also could speak about this, about full cost perspective. I think there are reflections going on about this subject. I work with some people who are very skilled in this area. For example, there are some consultancy firms now in France who try to favor another way to promote accountancy. And with some of these people, we went and we had discussions in big companies to suggest that they could try to assess their business, at least for one subsidiary, try to see how we could take into account in what really matters. It means considering natural and human entities not as assets but also as liabilities, and make sure that when we reflect from an accountancy perspective, we will maintain human and natural capital. So there are very interesting initiatives on this, and I think in terms of advocacy, we could and we should do much more on this aspect, because it's really changing the rules of the game and trying to make sure that the rules, the accountancy standards could be different. If they were different at a worldwide level, it would, and integrating social and environmental aspects right from the beginning, it could change the way businesses could envision their business models. So that's a second perspective. A third perspective is related to taxation. And so I won't enter into details because there are many aspects concerning taxation. I think for the past, at least since the subprime crisis in 2008. There have been discussions going on at the OECD level to try to fight against fiscal optimization and fiscal evasion to tax havens. Here also, I think NGOs have done a great job trying to put pressure on the government, on the European Union, in order to change the rules. And we have what we call the BEPS reports from OECD. It's base erosion and profit shifting. And in these reports analyze the different ways for companies and governments to shift the profit to tax havens. So, and I worked on these issues with a great friend of mine who was in charge of taxation issues in his big company. And it was interesting to say something about the change of mindset of some people. When I first published a book, it was my PhD dissertation, this friend who gave me a lot of information, and thanks to him I was able to discuss with top executive in charge of taxation in big companies and all this. He told me, well, you don't quote me because I will lose my job. And 3 years after, we published this collective book, 20 Proposals to Reform Capitalism. And this friend of mine chooses to have his name and not a pseudonym. And most of the others who were working in big banks said, well, I will use a pseudonym, or otherwise I will be fired. But he was very courageous, because he was thinking that he had to explain to parliament members, to different kinds of publics, all these technical subjects, because most of the time people are not skilled on taxation issues. They think that it's very complicated, and it is. But in fact, there are some principles that are quite easy to understand. And in fact, we also, as citizens, we have to know things about taxation and try to make collective choices about this. So these kind of people, I think that it's very interesting to see that now very skilled people work also in big NGOs and try to see what could be the step-by-step the possible changes in terms of taxation. Also, and of course, taxation is also about green taxation, and all the conversations are about what should we favor in terms of taxation, which leads me to the fourth perspective, which is related to wage distribution. Because of course, taxation is also about taxation for very rich people. And I've written a book with Gaël Giraud, the Jesuit I was mentioning, and the title of the book we published in French was Le Facteur 12, why we have to cap the top incomes. Mm-hmm. And we were suggesting of reducing from 1 to 12 the gap between the highest salaries and the lowest salaries in the companies, in public and private sector. Of course, for the private sector, it would be through taxation that for the big company that we could achieve this goal. And it was very interesting to discuss with people working in big companies, try to understand why so many people are against this kind of perspective. And in fact, because you know that in US and United States, it's not a communist country. Till the 60s, for the highest salaries, the level of taxation on income was 93% of the income. So it's interesting to see that now we think that it's not possible to do this kind of measure. We'll say that it's not fair, but in fact, in the US from the 30s till the 60s, we had because it was after the New Deal and people were reflecting in terms of social justice, so they had some criteria. And so, well, I think maybe we can speak of shifting baselines. The fact that we don't have the same kind of moral or ethical criteria, but we could change the way we think about all these issues. So that the fourth aspect. And the fifth one, maybe it's also a very transversal perspective, it's about changing the legal definition of the firm. And also in France, I have an interview next week with with the CEO of Michelin, the big company, and he has been asked by our Minister of Economics to make audition, to interview people on for the next law on economy in France. So it's the minister. It's called the law Le Maire, the name of the minister. And he asked the CEO of Michelin and another person who is skilled in terms of extra financial assessment of companies to have interviews with different kinds of people about different subjects, and one of the subjects is about changing the legal definition of the firm in the French Code Civil. The way the definition that we give, in fact, is a definition not of the enterprise of the firm, but of the commercial society, and it's since I think the beginning of the 19th century we have the same definition. The fact that people can join and create a business, and the goal is to make money and then to make profit. And so most of the time we say, well, the goal of any company is to make profit. And that's it. And most of the time, when we have shareholders, we say that the shareholders are the owners of the company. And in fact, I think in all our countries for the past maybe 10 or 15 years, there have been some experts who say, well, it's not true. We cannot say that the shareholders are owners of the company. They just own shares of the company. And then, in fact, we realize that there is no legal definition of the enterprise. And the changes that are envisioned, but I don't think we will succeed in having a new definition, because the big companies are completely against them. They are lobbying a lot right now, trying to make sure that there won't be any law that will change the definition of the firm. But the proposals are very interesting. And in the collective book that we wrote, we had a lawyer working with us who suggested a change in the way we define the commercial entity, and he was saying that we should consider any enterprise as a collective project, so people combining their efforts in order to create a business. And it says, well, so profit is a means, a necessary means, and we have to make sure that the goal, the purpose of the firm is consistent with, we can speak of general interest or the common good. So there are many different definitions, possible definitions, and of course it would create a lot of debates on what do we, when we speak of general interest, what does it mean exactly? But at least the idea is to consider profit as a means and not as the goal, and make sure that when people start businesses, it's consistent with, for example, the Paris Agreement, with the future generations and all these. So all these perspectives, of course, we can say that it's a bit idealistic, but what I find interesting is that all this, at least in France, for the past 5 or 10 years, well, I think there is a kind of the change of mindset for some people working in big companies. My experience was that when I started and I met with these kind of top executives 15 years ago, some of them were telling me that I was a red sister, and that it was, and maybe that I was a utopian or like an activist and all this. And I've been working with people who are working in these big companies for the past 15 years, who provide ideas, who try to analyze what's going on. And what I find a very good, we can be hopeful that more and more people from the business world will try to foster dialogue with other people and try to see how we can maybe through acknowledging the global challenges that we have to face, try to look at their own situation and at their businesses in a different way. And I think that the encyclical letter is also I don't know exactly the experience in England. Sometimes in France, I felt that it was easier to discuss about the encyclical letter with people interested in ecology than with Catholic conservative people. But at least I think the Pope is very tough on many issues, and maybe it's. With some Catholics that I met with and who are a bit conservative, I can say, and some of them told me that they felt that that also what the Pope was saying is a kind of prophetic perspective, and that they had to look at the situation of the poorest and maybe change the glasses with whom they look at the situations. So, I think we have a lot. We have so many challenges, and we really have to face a very difficult situation. But then I'm also impressed by all the positive initiatives at the grassroots, and maybe we could discuss about this and how you see the possible ways of going forward. And I think that all of us in our communities we can do things. And in our professional, those who are practitioners, and with different kind of skills, we can try to combine our efforts and act differently. And just to finish, I really think that we have to lead this kind of collective and not only personal discernment. And I say this because I work a lot with the Jesuits, and I feel that, and I think that the general or the Jesuits wrote a letter to all Jesuits saying that they had to put an emphasis on discerning in common. But I think it's not only for the Jesuits; it's for all of us, and we really have to try to see how we can engage with others in a slightly different way that we have.